Enough. Judge Randall slammed his gavel so hard it echoed through the courtroom. He leaned back in his chair, staring down at the young woman before him with a smirk. You think you can stand here and lecture me on the law? He scoffed, shaking his head. I've been on this bench for 30 years. 30. And you? He gestured at her, his voice thick with mockery. You're just some quiet nobody who probably Googled a few legal terms last night. The courtroom chuckled, joining in his amusement. The woman, standing tall in a simple blue blazer, remained unfazed. She didn't fidget. She didn't shrink. Judge Randall. She finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. Are you done? The judge's smirk faltered. The room grew silent. A strange tension filled the air. Then she stepped forward, placing a thick legal book on the table before her. Her next words sent a shockwave through the entire courtroom. Because if you are, I'd like to remind you of a ruling from this very court, made by you, in fact, where you argued the exact opposite of what you're claiming now. Judge Randall's face paled. The courtroom gasped. Who was this woman? The morning had been quiet. Too quiet. The courtroom was nearly empty except for a few scattered attendees. Lawyers preparing for their cases, a clerk organizing files, and the slow hum of the ceiling fans. It was supposed to be just another routine hearing for Judge Randall, a man known for his sharp tongue and quick temper. Today, he was presiding over what he assumed was a simple dispute. An eviction case. A small-time landlord versus a quiet woman who barely spoke a word when she first entered the courtroom. She had introduced herself simply. My name is Grace Sullivan, Your Honor. Randall barely glanced at her. She looked ordinary. Unimpressive. Certainly not someone he expected to challenge him. The landlord, Mr. Benson, was a loud, balding man in his 50s. He had arrived with an expensive lawyer, a smug-looking man in a gray suit who greeted the judge as if they were old friends. This should be quick, Your Honor, Benson's lawyer had said. Ms. Sullivan has no legal representation. We'll keep it simple. Judge Randall had nodded in agreement. He had seen cases like this before. People like Grace didn't stand a chance. She was soft-spoken, dressed plainly, and had no lawyer to back her up. She was going to lose. Or so he thought. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she cleared her throat and stepped forward. The entire courtroom expected her to fumble, to beg, to make some emotional plea about how she had nowhere else to go. Instead, she calmly opened a worn leather notebook and began speaking. Your Honor, before we continue, I'd like to point out that my eviction notice is invalid under state law. Randall raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. Grace didn't hesitate. The notice was served incorrectly. Under Section 83.56 of our state tenant laws, a proper eviction requires at least a 7-day notice for alleged lease violations. I was given only 3 days. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Randall frowned. He glanced at Benson's lawyer, expecting a quick rebuttal, but the man seemed caught off guard. The judge cleared his throat. That may be a clerical error, Miss Sullivan, but it doesn't change the fact that you violated your lease, does it? Benson's lawyer smirked, sensing an opportunity. Exactly, Your Honor. Ms. Sullivan's lease clearly states that. Grace lifted a hand. With all due respect, before you continue, I'd like to submit Exhibit A. She placed a document on the table. Randall sighed. And what is this? My lease agreement, she said simply, which contains no such violation. The judge blinked. Benson's lawyer snatched the document and skimmed through it. His face tightened. He whispered something to Benson, who suddenly looked less confident. Randall watched the exchange, frowning. What's going on? Benson's lawyer coughed. Well, it appears there is a discrepancy, Your Honor. Grace didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply waited. For the first time in the hearing, Judge Randall actually looked at her. Who is this woman? Ms. Sullivan, he said, trying to regain control. You seem well-versed in law. Where exactly did you get this information? Grace met his gaze. Her voice was still calm. I study the law, Your Honor. Every day. Something about the way she said it sent a chill down his spine. The courtroom was silent, waiting for what would happen next. Then Judge Randall did something unexpected. He laughed. Loudly. You study the law? He repeated mockingly. Let me guess, YouTube videos? A few late-night Google searches? Maybe you printed a Wikipedia page before coming here. The courtroom erupted in quiet chuckles. Grace didn't flinch. Judge Randall leaned forward, shaking his head. Listen, young lady, this is a court of law. not a classroom for self-taught amateurs. You can't just come in here and pretend to know more than the professionals. Benson's lawyer grinned, nodding in agreement. Grace simply stared at them. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a thick legal book, and set it down with a thud on the table. Judge Randall's smirk vanished. "If I may, Your Honor," she said, flipping through the pages, "I'd like to remind you of a ruling you made in this very courtroom last year." She found the page and pointed. "In Benson versus Clarkson, you ruled that any improperly served eviction notice was grounds for dismissal." Randall's face paled. Grace turned another page. "And in Harris versus Davis, you personally stated that, quote, the court cannot and will not overlook errors in due process, no matter how small." The courtroom gasped. Judge Randall opened his mouth, but no words came out. Benson's lawyer scrambled to find a response, but his hands shook as he flipped through his notes. Grace slowly closed the book. "Now, Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "if you're done mocking me, I'd like to proceed with my defense." A stunned silence filled the room. The judge swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, he was speechless. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. No one spoke. No one dared to. Judge Randall's fingers curled around the edges of his bench, his jaw tightening. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to protest, but nothing came out. He was staring at Grace as though seeing her for the first time. The quiet woman he had just mocked, humiliated, had just thrown his own words back at him. Not just any words. His own rulings. A hush settled over the room, the weight of it pressing down on everyone. Even the court stenographer had stopped typing. Benson's lawyer, previously full of confidence, was now frantically flipping through his notes, looking for a way out. His face had lost its smugness, replaced by something bordering on panic. Judge Randall finally found his voice. "How?" His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before speaking again. "How do you know about that ruling?" Grace didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She simply met his gaze and said, "Because I make it my job to know." She let her words settle before continuing. "Just because I don't have a law degree doesn't mean I don't understand the law, Your Honor. And just because I don't shout doesn't mean I don't have something important to say." The courtroom doors creaked as someone stepped in. A few heads turned, but all eyes quickly snapped back to the unfolding drama. Judge Randall shifted in his seat, the power dynamic in the room shifting in a way he had never experienced before. Then, as if to reclaim his authority, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his desk. "All right," he said, forcing himself to sound composed. "You've made your point, but you still haven't answered the main question." He steepled his fingers. "If you know so much about the law, Miss Sullivan, why aren't you a lawyer?" Grace hesitated, just for a second, but Randall caught it. The way her fingers brushed over the leather-bound legal book, the way her lips pressed together in thought. Then she said, quietly, "Because life doesn't always go as planned, Your Honor." The answer felt like it carried weight, more than she was willing to explain. Randall studied her for a moment, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze that wasn't just arrogance. It was curiosity. He opened his mouth to push further, but before he could, the courtroom doors slammed open. A security officer rushed in, his voice urgent. "Your Honor, there's a situation outside." The tension that had been focused entirely on Grace suddenly shifted. People turned. Murmurs spread like wildfire. Judge Randall frowned, annoyed by the disruption. "What kind of situation?" The officer's expression was grim. "It's Benson's properties, sir. His tenants. There's a protest outside the courthouse. It's getting out of hand." Benson, the landlord, who had been trying to shrink into his chair, went pale. "What?" The officer nodded. "They're saying he's been running illegal evictions for years. Some of them claim he forged lease agreements. And someone," the officer glanced at Grace before continuing, "has been helping them gather evidence." A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Judge Randall turned back to Grace, his eyes narrowing. "Is this true?" Grace met his gaze, calm as ever. "I told you, Your Honor." She lifted her chin slightly. "I study the law. Every day." Randall exhaled slowly. The case before him had just become much bigger than an eviction dispute. And somehow, the quiet woman standing before him was at the center of it all. The morning had started like any other for Grace. She woke up early, the sun barely peeking through her window. The small apartment she lived in was nothing special, Just a tiny space with secondhand furniture and stacks of legal books that covered every surface. Most people wouldn't have guessed it, but she had spent years studying the law. Not in a university, not with professors, but on her own. She had a talent for it. A mind that could pick apart legal arguments like pieces of a puzzle. But none of that mattered when you didn't have the right degree, the right title, the right connections. People didn't take her seriously. Still, that didn't stop her from helping where she could. She had seen too many people, good people, lose everything just because they didn't understand their rights. She had seen landlords like Benson bend the law in ways that hurt the most vulnerable. And she had decided a long time ago that she wasn't just going to stand by and watch. When she received her own eviction notice, she knew exactly what was happening. It wasn't just about her. It was about all the other tenants, too. So she had spent the last few weeks gathering evidence, researching, preparing. And when she walked into that courtroom, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced. Back in the courtroom, Judge Randall tapped his gavel twice. "All right," he said, rubbing his temple. "This is getting bigger than I expected. We'll take a short recess before we continue." He stood up, but before he could step away, Grace spoke. "Your Honor." Randall paused, turning back. "What?" Grace tilted her head slightly. "Before you take your break, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence." Benson's lawyer groaned. "Oh, come on." But Grace was already placing another file on the table. Randall sighed. "What now?" Grace folded her hands in front of her. "This document contains records of at least 6 other illegal evictions tied to Mr. Benson's properties, complete with timestamps, lease agreements, and witness statements." Benson's lawyer's face drained of color. Randall's fingers drummed against the bench. Then he reached for the file, flipping through the pages. With every line he read, his expression hardened. When he finally looked up, he didn't just look annoyed anymore. He looked furious. "Benson," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, "you better have a good explanation for this." Benson's mouth flapped open, but no words came out. The courtroom watched as the arrogant landlord, who had walked in confident he would win, now looked like a man on the edge of disaster. Randall set the file down with a thud. Then he turned back to Grace. For the first time, there was something new in his expression. Respect. "You're not just here for yourself, are you?" he asked. Grace met his gaze, unwavering. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I'm here for everyone you ignored." The room was deathly silent. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. But before the case could move forward, the courtroom doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't a security officer. It was a lawyer, a tall man in an expensive black suit, carrying a briefcase, his expression unreadable. He strode straight to the judge's bench, barely glancing at anyone else. Judge Randall narrowed his eyes. "And who exactly are you?" The lawyer smoothed his tie and spoke. "My name," he said, his voice deep and commanding, "is David Calloway." Then he turned to Grace. "And I'm here for her." Gasps filled the courtroom. Grace blinked, startled. The judge frowned. "You're representing her?" David's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Not exactly." He turned to Grace. His eyes studied her carefully, as if he knew something no one else did. Then he said the last thing anyone expected. "I'm here to offer her a job." The courtroom exploded into noise. And just like that, everything changed. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Murmurs turned into gasps, and gasps turned into full-blown chatter. Even Judge Randall, a man known for his icy composure, looked genuinely stunned. "A job?" he repeated, his brows furrowing. David Calloway remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The expensive lawyer carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who never lost, and his tailored suit only reinforced that fact. Grace, however, stood frozen. She hadn't expected this. She had come prepared to fight for her home. She had come ready to prove her knowledge of the law. But this? She hadn't seen this coming. Grace started, but her voice faltered. Judge Randall, quickly recovering from his own shock, banged his gavel. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is a courtroom, not a job fair. Mr. Calloway, if you have business with Ms. Sullivan, you can take it outside. Right now, we have a case to finish." David Calloway turned his gaze toward the judge, completely unbothered. He nodded once. "Understood, Your Honor." Then, before stepping back, he looked at Grace one more time and said, "We'll talk after." Grace didn't know why, but the way he said it sent a strange chill down her spine. Judge Randall sighed, rubbing his temples. Now, where were we? He looked down at the evidence Grace had presented. His eyes darkened. Ah, yes, Mr. Benson. But before he could continue, Benson's lawyer stood abruptly. He was sweating now, his entire confident persona crumbling. Your Honor, the lawyer said quickly. I, would like to request a recess before we proceed any further. Randall narrowed his eyes. And why is that? Benson's lawyer swallowed hard. Because it seems I may need to have a conversation with my client. Randall glanced at Benson, whose face was an unhealthy shade of red. The man looked like he was moments away from bolting out the door. The judge exhaled sharply. Fine. Recess granted. But I expect you both back here in 10 minutes. Not a second longer. With that, he slammed his gavel, signaling a break. The moment he did, Benson's lawyer grabbed his client by the arm and dragged him toward the hallway. The two whispered furiously as they disappeared. Grace remained standing, trying to process everything that had just happened. That's when she felt someone step beside her. David Calloway. She turned her head slightly, glancing at him. What do you want? She asked, her voice quieter than before. David smiled slightly, but it wasn't condescending. It was curious. I want to know where you learned to do that, he said, motioning toward the judge's bench. That was the most precise legal takedown I've seen in a long time. And I've seen a lot. Grace pursed her lips. I already told you. I study the law. David tilted his head, as if studying her. That's not the whole story. She stiffened. Of course it wasn't. But before she could respond, David's expression turned serious. I meant what I said in there. I have a job for you. Grace scoffed. Doing what? Getting coffee for real lawyers. David smirked. No. Practicing law. She blinked. He continued. I run a firm that specializes in high-stakes cases. People who need help but can't get it because the system is stacked against them. I could use someone like you. Grace shook her head. I'm not a lawyer. David raised an eyebrow. Could have fooled me. She looked away, feeling something uncomfortable rise in her chest. It was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. But she couldn't afford that. Not now. Before she could answer, the courtroom doors burst open again. Benson and his lawyer had returned, but they weren't alone. Behind them stood two uniformed officers. And suddenly, the energy in the room shifted. Judge Randall frowned. What's this? One of the officers stepped forward. Your Honor, we've received new evidence regarding Mr. Benson's business practices. After reviewing Ms. Sullivan's documents, we found enough probable cause to launch an official investigation. A wave of gasps filled the courtroom. Benson's lawyer paled. Wait, there must be some mistake. The officer ignored him and turned to Benson. Mr. Benson, you are under arrest for fraudulent eviction practices, forgery, and multiple counts of tenant harassment. Please turn around. Benson's mouth opened in horror. What? The officer grabbed his wrist and began to cuff him. No, you don't understand. Benson shouted, struggling. This was just a misunderstanding. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the powerful landlord was dragged away like a common criminal. Judge Randall didn't even try to stop it. He simply exhaled and shook his head. Well, that escalated quickly. Benson's lawyer, now completely useless, sank into his chair, rubbing his face in defeat. Meanwhile, Grace just stood there, staring. It was over. She had won. Not just for herself, but for everyone Benson had wronged. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As if reading her thoughts, David Calloway leaned slightly toward her and whispered, I'm going to ask you one more time, Grace. She turned her head toward him, her heart pounding. Are you sure you're not a lawyer? She didn't answer, because, deep down, she wasn't so sure anymore. The courtroom emptied slowly. People whispered amongst themselves, casting glances at Grace as they passed. Some were in awe, others in disbelief. But one thing was clear. She had shaken the very foundations of that room. Judge Randall remained seated at his bench, rubbing his temple as if trying to process what had just happened. The arrogant landlord, Benson, had been arrested right in front of him. All because of a woman he had dismissed as insignificant just moments earlier. Grace, however, stood motionless. She had won. She should have felt relief. She should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt exposed. Like everyone had just seen a part of her she had spent years hiding. She started gathering her documents, keeping her head down. The moment she stepped out of that courtroom, she'd be back to being invisible. And that was how she liked it. Or at least, that was how she thought she liked it. A shadow fell over her table. "You didn't answer me," David Calloway said. Grace sighed, not looking up. "I thought the court was in recess." David chuckled. "It is. But I'm not here as a lawyer right now. I'm here as someone who just watched you do the impossible." She finally lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. "And what's that?" David leaned against the table, lowering his voice. "You just outmaneuvered an experienced attorney. You made a judge second-guess himself. And you did it without a license, a degree, or a firm backing you up." Grace looked away. "I was just defending myself." David shook his head. "No, you were practicing law." She swallowed, gripping the edges of her legal book a little tighter. Then, David straightened up and gestured toward the door. "Come with me." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Why?" "Because I have something to show you," he said simply. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away, to leave before this got any deeper. But for some reason, she followed him. They walked down the long, marble hallway of the courthouse. Grace was quiet, her mind racing. Who was David Calloway? And why was he so interested in her? They finally stopped outside a large glass office labeled Calloway and Associates. Her stomach twisted. David held the door open for her. "After you." She stepped inside cautiously, taking in the expensive leather chairs, the sleek bookshelves, and the high ceilings. This wasn't just a firm. This was power. David walked over to a desk and picked up a file. He held it out to her. "Go ahead," he said. Grace took it hesitantly and flipped it open. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside were cases, names of tenants, legal documents, copies of illegal eviction notices. She looked up sharply. "What is this?" David crossed his arms. "It's everything I've been working on." Grace frowned. "Working on what?" David sighed, stepping closer. "Exposing people like Benson. Fighting against landlords who think they can cheat the system. Helping people who don't have a voice." Grace's fingers tightened around the folder. This was exactly what she had been doing. But alone. She looked up at him warily. "And what do you want from me?" David smiled. "I want you on my team." She froze. "What?" David gestured to the files. "You've already proven you can do the work. You're smart. You understand the law better than most first-year attorneys. And you clearly have a passion for justice." Grace shook her head. "But I'm not a lawyer." David smirked. "Yet." She inhaled sharply. "Yet." A simple word, but one that planted something dangerous in her heart. Hope. She swallowed hard. I don't know if I can." David studied her for a long moment. Then he grabbed another folder from his desk and slid it toward her. Grace hesitated before picking it up. It wasn't another case. It was an application. For law school. Her hands trembled slightly. David's voice softened. "I did some research on you, Grace. You were top of your class in high school. You got a full ride to a university, but you never attended. Then you disappeared." She stiffened. David leaned in slightly. "What happened?" Grace's throat tightened. Memories she had buried long ago came rushing back. The reason she had walked away from everything. The reason she never stepped into a university classroom. But she wasn't ready to talk about that. Not yet. Instead, she closed the folder and placed it back on his desk. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Calloway, but I don't think I'm what you're looking for." David didn't look surprised. He just smiled. "Take your time." She turned to leave. But just as she reached the door, David called out, "Oh, and Grace." She paused, glancing over her shoulder. He smirked. "This case isn't over." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" David leaned back against his desk, folding his arms. "Benson was just the beginning. There are bigger players behind him. People who have been exploiting the law for years." Grace's stomach twisted. "Benson was sloppy," David continued. "But the people behind him? They know how to cover their tracks. And they're not going to be happy about what happened today." A chill ran down Grace's spine. She had spent so much time preparing for this case. She had thought she was done. But David was right. Something told her this fight was only beginning. Before she could respond, a loud noise echoed through the hallway. Bang! Grace's heart jumped. David's expression darkened. They both turned toward the courtroom doors, just in time to see two men in dark suits storm inside, their faces grim. And standing between them was Judge Randall. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists. And when he spoke, his voice carried something Grace had never heard from him before. "Fear. We have a problem," Randall said. David tensed. What kind of problem? Randall swallowed hard. The kind that doesn't end in a courtroom. Grace's blood ran cold. And just like that, she realized she wasn't just up against a corrupt landlord anymore. She was up against something much bigger. The air in the courthouse hallway thickened, tension wrapping around Grace like a vice. Judge Randall stood before them, flanked by two men in dark suits. His usual arrogance was gone. In its place was something unsettling, fear. David Calloway was the first to react. His sharp gaze flicked between the judge and the two men. "I don't like surprises, Randall," he said smoothly. "So why don't you start talking?" Randall hesitated. He glanced at the men beside him before speaking. "We need to go somewhere private." David crossed his arms. "Why?" Randall lowered his voice. "Because this case just escalated into dangerous territory." Grace's pulse quickened. She had expected backlash from exposing Benson's fraudulent eviction practices, but dangerous? One of the men in suits stepped forward. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, his voice professional but firm. "You need to come with us." Grace stiffened. "Excuse me." David moved slightly in front of her, protective. "And who exactly are you?" The man pulled out a badge. "Special Agent Carter. FBI." Grace's breath hitched. "The FBI?" David's jaw tensed. "And what does the Bureau want with her?" Agent Carter exchanged a glance with his partner before answering. "Because we believe Ms. Sullivan just disrupted something much bigger than an illegal eviction ring." Silence. Grace swallowed hard. "What are you talking about?" Randall stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Benson wasn't working alone, Sullivan. He was just a puppet. The real people behind this. They're powerful. They're dangerous. And now," he exhaled sharply, "now they know your name." A chill ran down Grace's spine. David's posture stiffened. "How much danger are we talking?" Agent Carter's expression was unreadable. "Enough that Ms. Sullivan needs protection. Effective immediately." Grace's heart pounded. "Protection?" The second agent finally spoke. "Ms. Sullivan, you just took down the first piece of a much larger operation. The people funding these illegal evictions, they don't just own properties. They own judges, lawyers, politicians." His gaze darkened. "And they don't like losing." Grace's mouth went dry. Randall cleared his throat. "Look, I may not have treated you with much respect before," he admitted, his voice quieter. "But listen to me now. These people don't play by the rules." Grace's fingers trembled slightly. This wasn't what she had signed up for. She had fought for justice, but she hadn't expected it to come with a target on her back. David must have sensed her hesitation because he placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We're not going anywhere until we get some answers." Agent Carter sighed. "Fine, but not here." He gestured toward the exit. "We need to move. Now." Grace looked at David. David looked at her. Neither of them spoke. But they both knew, whatever this was, it was bigger than either of them had imagined. And there was no turning back now. The FBI had an office not far from the courthouse. A plain, gray building with tinted windows and security cameras at every corner. Grace sat stiffly in a conference room, David beside her, his expression unreadable. Across from them sat Agents Carter and his partner, a woman named Agent Reeves. Judge Randall stood off to the side, arms crossed tightly. On the table before them was a thick manila folder. It had Grace's name on it. Agent Reeves was the first to speak. "Miss Sullivan, before we show you this file, you need to understand something." She leaned forward. "What you did in that courtroom today, it was remarkable." Grace's hands curled in her lap. Agent Carter nodded. "But it also made you a problem for some very powerful people." David, ever the strategist, cut in. "Names. Who are we dealing with?" Agent Carter sighed. "We don't know all of them yet. But we do know Benson was just one of many landlords running fraudulent evictions. And all of them answer to someone higher." Agent Reeves slid the folder across the table. "Open it." Grace hesitated, then flipped it open. Her stomach clenched. Inside were pages of financial records, documents, and photographs. Some she recognized from her own research. Others were new and far more alarming. There were names listed. Names she hadn't come across before. But the one that caught her attention the most. Judge Randall. Her eyes snapped up to him. "You were part of this." Randall flinched. Not willingly. His voice was tight. "They approached me years ago. Told me to look the other way when certain eviction cases came through my court. At first, I didn't ask questions." He exhaled. "Then I realized what was really happening. But by that time," he hesitated. "Let's just say, once you're in, you don't get to walk away." Grace's stomach churned. David's jaw clenched. So why are you helping now? Randall ran a hand through his graying hair. Because Ms. Sullivan just did what I never had the courage to do. She stood up to them. A silence stretched between them. Then Agent Carter leaned forward. Here's the problem. Now that you've disrupted their operation, they're going to retaliate. Grace exhaled slowly. What do you mean by retaliate? Agent Reeves didn't sugarcoat it. They're going to come after you. The room felt colder. David's voice was sharp. Then we go after them first. Randall blinked. Excuse me. David turned to the agents. You said these people are careful, right? That they cover their tracks. Agent Carter nodded. Yes. David smirked. Well, so is she. He motioned toward Grace. She's been uncovering their mess for weeks without them even realizing it. Grace frowned. What are you saying? David's gaze was intense. I'm saying we don't run. We fight. Randall scoffed. That's insane. David ignored him. These people think they own the system. They think they can bully, threaten, and erase anyone who stands in their way. But they made one mistake. Agent Reeves tilted her head. And what's that? David's smirk grew. They underestimated her. Grace's heart pounded. Was he serious? Going after an entire network of corruption? She wasn't a lawyer. She wasn't an FBI agent. She was just Grace. But as she looked around the room, she realized something. She had already done the impossible once. Maybe, just maybe, she could do it again. She took a slow breath, steadied herself, and met David's gaze. What's the plan? A heavy silence followed Grace's words. Judge Randall pinched the bridge of his nose as if he had just heard the most reckless thing imaginable. You can't be serious. Agent Carter folded his arms. Going after these people is dangerous, Miss Sullivan. This isn't just about corrupt landlords anymore. It's about the people behind them. The ones with the power to bury you. Grace tightened her jaw. I already put a target on my back. Running won't change that. David smirked, clearly impressed. She's right. The only way out is through. Randall scoffed. You lawyers and your theatrics. He turned to Grace, his tone laced with frustration. Do you even realize what you're saying? These people have judges, politicians, entire firms under their thumb. You've exposed them, yes, but that doesn't mean they'll just let you walk away. Grace met his gaze evenly. Then we don't give them a choice. Randall sighed, shaking his head. You have no idea how deep this goes. Agent Reeves flipped open another folder. Actually, she's about to find out. She slid the file across the table toward Grace. Grace hesitated before opening it. Inside were records, thick financial trails, falsified eviction notices, offshore bank accounts. The deeper she looked, the more horrifying the patterns became. This wasn't just about landlords cheating tenants. This was a business. Dozens of fraudulent landlords. Hundreds of illegal evictions. Money funneled through shell companies. Masked under fake renovation projects. And at the very center of it, Grace's stomach dropped. A name. One she recognized instantly. Walter Remington. She whispered the name aloud, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Judge Randall went stiff. Agent Carter and Agent Reeves exchanged glances. Even David's smirk faltered. Grace looked up. Who is he? Agent Carter leaned forward, his tone dark. Walter Remington is one of the most untouchable real estate moguls in the country. On paper, he's a respected businessman, philanthropist, and political donor. But underneath that, he shook his head. He owns people, Miss Sullivan. Judges, police chiefs, bankers, even some folks in the FBI. If you've ever wondered why corrupt landlords like Benson never get caught, it's because of him. David exhaled sharply. Well, that explains a lot. Randall nodded grimly. It also explains why you're in way over your head. Grace stared down at the file. Her pulse quickened. Walter Remington, a billionaire, a man with his hands in every major property deal in the state, a man who could make people disappear with a single phone call. And now, she had just made herself his newest problem. David drummed his fingers against the table. So what's our play? Randall scoffed. You don't have a play. The best thing you can do is walk away before Remington even realizes you exist. Agent Reeves sighed. It's too late for that. If we have this file, they know she's seen it. Grace inhaled slowly. Then we expose him before he can bury me. Randall stared at her in disbelief. You really think you can take down Walter Remington? Grace clenched her fists. If we have enough evidence, if we go public before he can shut it down. Randall laughed bitterly. You don't get it, do you? You could have video of him committing a crime, and it still wouldn't matter. He has judges in his pocket. Prosecutors, too. No one would take the case. David smirked. Then we don't go to a judge. Everyone turned to him. David leaned forward. People like Remington win because they control the system. But they hate the one thing they can't control. Grace's breath caught. The public, she whispered. David nodded. Exactly. Agent Carter frowned. So you're suggesting what? We take this case to the media? David grinned. No. I'm suggesting we make it a spectacle. Randall's eyes widened. You're insane. David shrugged. That's debatable. But one thing isn't. Remington hates bad press. His entire empire depends on his public image. If we go straight to the people, release the files, get the victims to speak up, he won't be able to make it disappear, Grace finished. David snapped his fingers. Bingo. Agent Reeves looked skeptical. That's risky. David smirked. Only if we fail. Randall exhaled sharply. You will fail. He pointed at Grace. You don't have a firm. You don't have a law degree. You don't even have resources. What you're talking about isn't just reckless, it's suicidal. Grace met his gaze, unwavering. Maybe, but that doesn't mean I won't try. Randall sighed, rubbing his face. You remind me of someone I used to know. Grace tilted her head. Who? Randall chuckled dryly. Me. Before I learned how the world really works. A heavy silence followed. Agent Carter leaned back. All right, let's say we do this. What's the first move? David grinned. Glad you asked. He turned to Grace. Do you still have copies of all the cases you worked on before Benson? Grace nodded. Yes. What? David's eyes gleamed. Because tomorrow morning, we're going to introduce the world to Grace Sullivan, the legal prodigy who just took down an entire corruption ring. Grace's breath hitched. Randall groaned. I need a drink. Agent Carter sighed. I need a new job. David laughed. And I need a press conference. Grace swallowed hard. Because now it was real. Tomorrow, the world would know her name. And Walter Remington would know exactly where to find her. The weight of what they had just decided settled over Grace like a storm cloud. Tomorrow, she would step into the spotlight. Tomorrow, she would paint a target on her back so large even Walter Remington couldn't ignore it. And tomorrow, she would either take down one of the most powerful men in the country or be crushed by him. David seemed unbothered. In fact, he looked thrilled. He was already firing off messages on his phone, probably contacting reporters, activists, and every legal contact he had. Agent Carter and Agent Reeves exchanged uneasy glances. They didn't seem convinced this was a good idea. Judge Randall looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But it was too late now. The plan was set. Grace inhaled slowly, steadying herself. So what's the first step? David grinned. We control the narrative before they do. The next morning, press conference. The courthouse steps were swarming with people. News cameras lined the pavement. Reporters jostled for position. Microphones stretched forward, waiting to capture the moment. A small crowd had gathered. Tenants, activists, people who had been victims of illegal evictions. They clutched signs with phrases like, housing is a right, not a business, and stop the landlord mafia. Grace stood behind the podium, gripping the edges tightly. Her heart was pounding. She had never spoken in front of so many people before. Never been the center of attention like this. David leaned in slightly. Breathe, he whispered. She nodded. Agent Carter stood off to the side, scanning the crowd for any threats. Agent Reeves was talking to security. Judge Randall, true to form, looked miserable. This is a terrible idea, he muttered. David ignored him. All right, Grace. Time to show them why they should listen to you. She exhaled sharply. Then she stepped forward. The murmurs quieted. The cameras zoomed in. She cleared her throat and spoke. My name is Grace Sullivan, she began, her voice steadier than she expected. I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a law degree. But for the past year, I have been studying the law because I had no choice. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. She continued. When I was faced with eviction, I did what thousands of people are forced to do every day. I tried to fight back. But what I found was worse than I ever imagined. She reached into her bag and pulled out a stack of documents. These are eviction notices. Dozens of them. Illegally processed. Fraudulent signatures. Notices that were designed to strip people of their homes without due process. She flipped the pages. The cameras zoomed in. And they were all connected to one man, Walter Remington. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Journalists started furiously scribbling notes. A few raised their hands, eager to ask questions. David smirked. She had them. Grace lifted her chin. Walter Remington has been running one of the largest fraudulent eviction rings in the country. He has politicians, judges, and lawyers under his control. He silences anyone who tries to stop him. And until now, no one has dared to stand against him. She took a deep breath. Until now. The crowd erupted. People cheered. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. David grinned like a proud teacher. "That's how you start a revolution," he murmured. Grace felt a rush of adrenaline. Maybe, just maybe, they could actually do this. But then, a gunshot rang out. The crowd screamed. People ducked. Cameras toppled over. Security officers shouted orders. David grabbed Grace, pulling her down behind the podium. Agent Carter and Agent Reeves rushed into action, scanning the rooftops. Judge Randall hit the ground, his face pale. "I told you this was a bad idea." Grace's heart hammered in her chest. Someone had just shot at them, and she knew exactly who had sent the message. Walter Remington. The escape. Agent Carter didn't waste time. "We need to move. Now." David pulled Grace up and practically dragged her toward a waiting black SUV. The crowd was in chaos. People were shouting, running in different directions. Security had formed a tight barrier, trying to control the scene. Another bang echoed. The SUV door flew open. "Get in," Agent Reeves ordered. Grace barely had time to think. She dove inside. David followed. Judge Randall, muttering, "I can't believe I'm doing this," climbed in last. The moment the doors slammed shut, the SUV peeled away from the courthouse. Grace's hands were shaking. Someone had just tried to kill her. David exhaled sharply. Well, that escalated quickly. Randall shot him a glare. "You think?" Agent Carter, driving at full speed, gritted his teeth. That wasn't just a warning. That was an execution attempt. Grace's stomach churned. Walter Remington wasn't waiting for the legal system to silence her. He was trying to erase her before she could become a real threat. Agent Reeves turned in her seat. "We need to get you somewhere safe. You can't go home. You can't use your phone. From this moment on, you're in hiding." Grace swallowed hard. "For how long?" Agent Carter's grip tightened on the wheel. "Until we take Remington down." A silence fell over the car. Grace closed her eyes, trying to slow her breathing. Her life had just changed forever. She wasn't just fighting a legal case anymore. She was in a war. David leaned closer. "Are you sure you still want to do this?" She opened her eyes. And for the first time, despite the fear, despite the danger, she knew her answer. "Yes." David grinned. "Good." Then he glanced out the window. "Because I think they just found us." Grace followed his gaze, and her blood turned to ice. A black SUV, identical to theirs, was barreling toward them from behind. Agent Carter cursed. "Hold on." The tires screeched. And just like that, the chase was on. The black SUV behind them closed in fast. Agent Carter gritted his teeth, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. "They're coming up fast. Buckle up." Grace barely had time to snap her seatbelt into place before the first hit came. Bam! Their vehicle lurched forward as the SUV rammed into their back bumper. David swore. "Oh, they're not playing around." Judge Randall looked like he was about to be sick. "This is not how I thought my day would go." Grace's pulse pounded in her ears. "Who are they?" Agent Reeves, seated in the front passenger seat, pulled out a pistol. "Remington's people. He's not waiting for the courts. He wants you gone now." Carter took a sharp right, tires screeching against the pavement. The SUV behind them followed, closing in again. Another hit. The car jerked, sending Grace crashing into David's side. "Okay," David groaned, steadying her. "I'm officially regretting this plan." Randall was gripping the handle above his door, so hard his knuckles were turning white. "I told you this was a bad idea." Grace barely had time to breathe before another impact sent their car spinning. Agent Carter growled. "That's it. Time to fight back." Reeves rolled down her window, aimed her gun, and fired. Bang! Bang! The SUV behind them swerved as one of its tires exploded. The driver fought for control, the vehicle skidding wildly before slamming into a parked car. Carter took the opportunity. He gunned the engine. Grace held on for dear life as they sped down the empty road, finally gaining distance. After several heart-pounding moments, Carter made a sudden turn into a narrow alleyway, killing the headlights. The SUV rolled to a stop. The engine hummed in the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. They listened. Seconds ticked by. No sign of pursuit. Carter exhaled. "I think we lost them." Grace slowly unclenched her fists. Her hands were trembling. David ran a hand through his hair. Well, that was fun. Randall shot him a look. You have a sick definition of fun. Grace let out a shaky breath. So what now? Agent Reeves turned in her seat, eyes sharp. Now? You disappear. Grace stiffened. Agent Carter nodded. Remington just made it clear. He's not waiting for you to build a case. He wants you gone before you can do any more damage. Grace swallowed. So what do I do? Reeves's expression was grim. We need to get you somewhere safe. Somewhere he can't find you. Grace clenched her fists. I don't want to hide. David gave her a sideways glance. I get it, Grace. But right now, you don't have a choice. You can't fight if you're dead. She exhaled slowly, frustration tightening in her chest. Randall rubbed his face. So, where are we taking her? Carter started the engine again, his voice firm. There's a safe house outside the city. No electronics. No contact with the outside world. You stay there until we find a way to end this. Grace hesitated. She had spent so long fighting. Preparing. Now, she was supposed to just disappear? David seemed to read her mind. He leaned in slightly, voice low. This isn't giving up, Grace. It's strategy. We let them think you're out of the game. And while they're looking for you, we move the pieces into place. She looked at him. And what are you going to do? David smirked. Make sure the whole world sees what they're trying to hide. The safe house. The drive took hours. By the time they arrived, the sky was a deep navy, the stars barely visible through thick tree branches. The safe house was nothing more than a cabin, tucked away in the woods. No streetlights. No signals. Completely off-grid. Agent Reeves pulled the SUV into the driveway and turned off the ignition. This is where you'll be staying. Grace stepped out cautiously, taking in her surroundings. It was eerily quiet. No sirens. No city hum. Just the sound of wind rustling through the trees. Carter handed her a burner phone. One number saved. Only call if it's an emergency. Grace nodded, gripping it tightly. Randall frowned. And what about us? Reeves exhaled. You and Calloway will be handling things on the outside. David grinned. Oh, don't worry. I'm going to make Remington very uncomfortable. Grace turned to him. Be careful. David's smirk softened slightly. You too, Prodigy. Something in the way he said it made her chest tighten. Reeves motioned to the cabin. Get inside. We'll be back for you when it's safe. Grace hesitated one last time. Then she stepped inside. The door closed behind her. And just like that, she disappeared. Meanwhile, Walter Remington sat in his office, fingers drumming against the polished wood of his desk. The attack had failed. Grace Sullivan was still alive. And now, instead of silencing her, he had just made her famous. The press conference had gone viral. His phone rang. He answered without a greeting. Tell me you have her. A cold voice on the other end responded. Not yet. Remington's grip tightened around his whiskey glass. I don't pay you for excuses. The voice didn't waver. We'll find her. Remington exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. You better. Because if she's alive by next week... His eyes darkened. She won't just be a legal problem anymore. She'll be a martyr. He set the glass down with a clink. Fix this. The line went dead. Remington closed his eyes. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Grace lay awake in the darkness of the safe house, staring at the wooden ceiling. The air smelled like pine and dust, and the silence was suffocating. She had fought so hard to be heard. Now, she was supposed to disappear? Hide in the shadows while David and the others worked on the outside. She clenched her fists. It wasn't just about her anymore. Walter Remington had made this personal. He had tried to kill her. And if she stayed here, trapped in this cabin while others fought for her, she'd never forgive herself. She sat up abruptly, her mind racing. There had to be something she could do. Something no one would see coming. Her eyes landed on the burner phone Carter had given her. One number saved. She picked it up, her thumb hovering over the call button. Don't be reckless, she told herself. Then again, playing it safe wasn't working either. She dialed. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. Grace. David. She exhaled, gripping the edge of the bed. Tell me everything. There was a pause. I thought you were supposed to be laying low. Grace smirked. Since when do I follow the rules? David chuckled. All right, Prodigy. You want an update? Here it is. She listened as he laid out their next move. By the time he finished, she was already reaching for her jacket. Grace, David warned, sensing her intent. Stay put. Not a chance, she said, standing. A pause. Then, David sighed. I had a feeling you'd say that. Meanwhile, the hunt begins. Walter Remington's private office was a masterpiece of wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows. A mahogany desk worth more than some houses. The city skyline glittered in the distance, but inside, the atmosphere was ice cold. A man in a dark suit stood across from him. Not one of his usual business partners. Not a politician on his payroll. A hunter. A fixer. She's still alive, Remington said, swirling the whiskey in his glass. His tone was calm, but the tension in his jaw said otherwise. The man nodded. Not for long. Remington studied him. Are you sure? The fixer smirked. I don't fail. Remington exhaled. Good. Because Grace Sullivan is proving to be more resilient than I expected. The fixer pulled out a phone and slid it across the desk. The screen lit up with grainy security footage. The safe house. Remington's brows lifted slightly. You found her. The fixer smiled. Of course. Then his smile widened. But the interesting part. He tapped the screen. Remington leaned in, watching, and his smirk vanished. Because Grace Sullivan was no longer at the safe house. She was gone. Remington's grip tightened around his glass until it cracked. Find her. His voice was deadly quiet. The fixer nodded. Already on it. The break-in. Grace moved silently through the alleyway, her heart pounding. David had given her the address. A storage facility on the edge of the city. One of Remington's facilities. She didn't have a team, didn't have a badge or legal authority, but she had something better. Knowledge. She knew where Remington's people stored their backup files, the ones they didn't want traced, and she was about to steal them. She reached the gate, pulling out the small tool kit she had swiped from the safe house. The lock wasn't complicated. A few clicks and snap. The lock fell open. Grace exhaled and slipped inside. She moved quickly, keeping low, scanning the row of metal storage units. David had said unit number 47. She found it, pulled out the lock-picking tools again. A second later, the door rolled open, and there it was. Boxes upon boxes of documents. Hard drives stacked on metal shelves. Evidence. Her pulse quickened. She stepped inside, reaching for the first file. A shadow moved behind her. Before she could react, something cold pressed against the back of her head. A gun. Nice try, sweetheart, a voice drawled. Her stomach plummeted. The fixer. She had walked straight into a trap. The cold steel of the gun barrel pressed against the back of Grace's skull. Her breath hitched. She had been careful. She had planned every move. But she had underestimated them. The fixer chuckled darkly behind her. Gotta admit, Sullivan, I expected you to stay in hiding a little longer. But you just had to play hero, didn't you? Grace's mind raced. She couldn't panic. Not now. Her eyes flickered around the dimly lit storage unit, searching for anything she could use. The fixer nudged her head with the gun. Turn around. Slowly. She obeyed, her pulse pounding in her ears. The man standing before her was in his late 40s, built like a boxer but with the sharp, predatory gaze of a professional killer. And that smirk. It sent a chill down her spine. He enjoyed this. So, the fixer mused, tilting his head. Tell me, Grace, what exactly was your plan here? Thought you'd sneak in, grab a few files, and bring down a man like Walter Remington. He clicked his tongue. Cute. Grace forced her expression to remain calm. If I was wrong, why are you here? His smirk faltered for just a second. Then bam. Grace moved. She grabbed the closest metal shelf and yanked it hard. The boxes on top came crashing down, and the fixer stumbled back, cursing as papers and hard drives rained over him. She didn't wait. She ran, darting through the storage unit. She weaved between shelves, knocking things over behind her. She could hear the fixer recovering, his heavy boots pounding after her. Wrong move, sweetheart, he snarled. A gunshot rang out. The bullet whizzed past her shoulder, slamming into a metal wall. She ducked into another aisle, heart pounding. She needed to think. Fast. Another gunshot. Then, her foot caught on something. She fell. Hard. Pain shot through her elbows as she hit the concrete floor. The fixer's footsteps slowed. Game over, he said, amusement dripping from his voice. Grace clenched her fists. Her eyes darted to a metal pipe lying near her hand. She had one shot. The fixer stepped closer, raising the gun. Night-night, sweetheart. Grace swung. The pipe smashed into his knee. He yelled in pain, stumbling back. Grace scrambled to her feet and ran. She burst through the storage unit door, sprinting into the alley. She wasn't fast enough. A hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. Not so fast, the fixer growled. He shoved her against the cold metal of a shipping container. His grip tightened around her throat. Grace gasped, kicking wildly. Her vision blurred. She clawed at his arm, but he was too strong. Then, a car engine roared nearby. Headlights flooded the alley. Tires screeched. And then, bam! The fixer was hit from the side and sent flying. Grace collapsed to the ground, coughing, gasping for breath. The car door swung open. A familiar voice called out. Grace, get in. David. Without thinking, she ran to the car and threw herself inside. David didn't wait. He slammed the gas. The car peeled away, the fixer groaning on the pavement behind them. Grace slumped in the passenger seat, sucking in ragged breaths. David glanced at her. You good? She coughed. Define good. David snorted. Fair point. She wiped the sweat off her brow. How did you? Tracked your burner phone, he admitted. Knew you'd pull something reckless. She shot him a glare. I wasn't being reckless. David raised an eyebrow. You just broke into Remington's personal storage unit alone. Grace hesitated. Okay, maybe a little reckless. David chuckled. Then his smile faded. Grace, he said, voice serious. You're in deep now. She exhaled. I know. David nodded. Then let's make it count. Meanwhile, Walter Remington's estate. Walter Remington watched the footage of the failed hit, his jaw tight. The fixer, now nursing his bruised ribs, stood across from him, looking frustrated. Remington remained silent for a long moment. Then, in a low, even voice, he said, Kill her. The fixer stiffened. No more games, Remington continued. No more warnings. I want her gone. A beat of silence. Then the fixer smirked. Consider it done. The car sped down the empty highway, the city lights shrinking in the rearview mirror. Grace sat in the passenger seat, still catching her breath. Her throat ached from where the fixer had nearly choked the life out of her. Her hands were scraped, her body sore. But she wasn't done. David tightened his grip on the wheel. We need to move fast. Remington won't sit back after this. Grace nodded. He's going to try again. David glanced at her. Not try? Succeed. His words sent a chill down her spine. She knew he was right. Remington had played defense long enough. Now he was going to attack. And if they didn't act first, she wouldn't live long enough to see justice. David took a sharp left onto a deserted road. Where are we going? Grace asked. To meet someone who can help, David said, his jaw tense. Grace frowned. Who? David exhaled. Someone who really hates Remington. The last ally. The warehouse was on the edge of the city. Old, abandoned. The kind of place where secrets were kept and deals were made. David killed the engine. Grace followed him inside, the smell of dust and oil heavy in the air. A single figure stood waiting. A woman, late 40s, sharp blue eyes, dressed in a leather jacket. She looked like someone who had seen too much and survived worse. She turned at the sound of their footsteps. You're late, she said. David smirked. We had an eventful evening. The woman's gaze flicked to Grace. So this is the girl making all the noise. Grace straightened. Grace Sullivan. The woman tilted her head, studying her. Joanne Mercer. Grace blinked. She knew that name. Wait, she narrowed her eyes. The prosecutor Joanne Mercer? The woman smirked. Not anymore. Grace's stomach flipped. Joanne Mercer had been a powerhouse in the legal world, until she suddenly vanished from public life. David leaned against a crate. Joanne was one of the few people who tried to take Remington down. She got close. Too close. Grace swallowed. What happened? Joanne's smirk faded. He ruined me. She crossed her arms. My case against him was airtight. Money laundering. Fraud. Illegal evictions. But the moment I got too close, she let out a bitter chuckle. My career was erased. The evidence disappeared. My name was dragged through the mud. Judges I trusted turned on me. Grace's heart pounded. He owns the system, Joanne continued. So I left. Went off the grid. Grace frowned. Then why help us now? Joanne's eyes darkened. Because I thought Remington was untouchable. She stepped closer. But then you happened. Grace swallowed. Joanne studied her carefully. You're not just fighting a case, kid. You're fighting a war. And wars need strategies. David grinned. Which is where you come in, Joe. Joanne sighed. You always pull me into your messes. David smirked. And yet, here you are. She rolled her eyes. Fine. But if we do this, we do it right. Grace nodded. Then let's take him down. The plan. They gathered around an old wooden table, spreading out files and blueprints. Joanne tapped a map of the city. Remington's empire isn't just built on fraud. It's built on fear. People don't testify against him because they're afraid. David nodded. So we take away that fear. Joanne's finger landed on a building. This is Remington's real vault. Grace frowned. I thought his evidence was in the storage unit. Joanne shook her head. That was a decoy. The real records, contracts, blackmail files, all the dirt he uses to control people. They're here. David whistled. Breaking in will be suicide. Joanne smirked. Which is why we're not breaking in. Grace tilted her head. Then what are we doing? Joanne's eyes gleamed. We're making him bring the evidence to us. Meanwhile, Walter Remington's office. Remington sat in his dimly lit office, sipping whiskey, his expression unreadable. The fixer stood across from him, bandaged but still standing. Remington swirled his glass. Sullivan's smarter than I thought. The fixer gritted his teeth. She got lucky. Remington set his drink down. I don't like luck. And I hate loose ends. He turned to his computer screen, where a security feed played in front of him. A camera had captured Grace, David, and Joanne entering the warehouse. Remington's jaw tightened. Joanne Mercer. He hadn't seen her in years. And now, she was back. His fingers curled into a fist. Burn them all, he ordered. The fixer hesitated. You mean? Remington's gaze was cold. No more warnings. No more threats. I want them all gone. The fixer's smirk returned. Consider it done. He turned to leave. But Remington's voice stopped him. One more thing. The fixer glanced back. Remington's lips curled. Make Sullivan watch. The fire. Grace was mid-sentence when she smelled it. Smoke. Her head snapped up. David stiffened. Do you smell? Then boom. An explosion tore through the warehouse, sending flames roaring through the walls. The force threw them backward. Grace hit the ground hard, coughing as thick black smoke filled the air. She heard shouting. David grabbed her arm, pulling her up. We have to move. Flames licked the ceiling. Sparks rained down. Joanne was already on her feet, her face grim. It's him. He found us. Another explosion rocked the building. The roof started collapsing. They ran, dodging falling debris, coughing through the smoke. Grace could barely see. The exit was only feet away. But then, a shadow moved through the smoke. And suddenly, the fixer was there, gun raised, blocking their only way out. His smirk was terrifying. Going somewhere. Grace's blood ran cold. David's jaw clenched. You really don't know when to quit, do you? The fixer chuckled. Neither do you. The fire raged around them. The building was seconds from collapse. And there they stood, trapped. The fire raged around them, thick smoke curling through the air. The warehouse groaned under the weight of the collapsing ceiling. And standing between them and the only exit was the fixer, gun raised, smirk in place, eyes cold. Grace's pulse pounded. They had come so far. She couldn't let it end here. Well, the fixer said, voice calm despite the chaos. This has been fun. David stepped slightly in front of Grace, his hands curling into fists. We don't have time for this. The fixer shrugged. Then I suggest you stand still. Might make this quicker. Joanne Mercer, standing just a few feet away, slowly moved her hand toward her jacket pocket. Grace's eyes flicked to her. Joanne gave the tiniest nod. She had something. A plan. Grace inhaled sharply, steeling herself. Why are you still working for Remington? She asked, stalling for time. The fixer raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. Grace took a slow step forward, ignoring David's warning glance. You're good at what you do, but men like him, they don't protect their people. When this is over, if you fail, he'll cut you loose. You know that. The fixer smirked. Cute speech, sweetheart. But I don't fail. Neither did Joanne, Grace countered. And look where she ended up. That made the fixer pause. Just for a second. And that was all they needed. Bang. Joanne moved first, pulling a small pistol from her jacket and firing. Not at the fixer, but at the ceiling beam above him. The shot rang through the air. The weakened beam snapped. Before the fixer could react, a massive chunk of burning debris collapsed on top of him, sending him crashing to the floor beneath the rubble. David grabbed Grace's wrist. Move. They ran. Through the smoke, through the crumbling warehouse. Joanne was right behind them, her face covered in soot, coughing as she sprinted for the exit. The doorway was seconds away. Then boom. The final explosion tore through the warehouse. Grace dived forward, hitting the ground just as the entire building behind them collapsed. For a moment, everything was fire. Then, silence. The aftermath. Grace woke to the sound of sirens. Cool air hit her face. She was lying on her back, staring up at a sky filled with smoke and flashing red lights. David crouched beside her, his face covered in soot, but otherwise unharmed. "Hey," he said. "You with me?" She coughed. "Barely." Joanne sat nearby, clutching her ribs. They had made it. They were alive. Grace pushed herself up, scanning the scene. Firefighters were battling the inferno that had once been the warehouse. Police officers swarmed the area. And then she saw him, Walter Remington, standing just outside the perimeter, dressed in a perfect suit, untouched by the chaos, watching the fire like it was nothing more than an inconvenience. His eyes met Grace's, and he smiled, a slow, knowing smirk, like he had already won. Grace's blood boiled. David saw him too. "He's not even worried. Because he thinks he's untouchable," Grace muttered. Joanne exhaled sharply. "He's not wrong. He'll just bury this like he's buried everything else." Grace clenched her fists. "Not this time." She reached into her jacket, pulling out a small black flash drive. David's eyes widened. "What's that?" Grace smirked. "Everything we need." Joanne blinked. "Wait, you got the files?" Grace nodded. "While I was in the storage unit. Before the fixer showed up." David let out a breathless laugh. "You sneaky, brilliant prodigy." Joanne grabbed the drive, turning it in her fingers. "This is enough to bury Remington. If we get this to the right people." Grace's gaze never left Remington's. "He's done." 1 week later, the fall of Walter Remington. The media storm was immediate. The leaked files were everywhere. Bank statements, forged eviction notices, bribery transactions, names of every judge, politician, and officer he had in his pocket. The scandal was unstoppable. The FBI launched an immediate investigation. And Walter Remington, the man who had never lost, was arrested. For the first time, the system he had built to protect himself was crumbling around him. Grace watched the footage from a small TV in David's office. There he was, handcuffed, surrounded by agents. His perfect life in ruins. David handed her a glass of whiskey. "To the prodigy who took down a billionaire." Grace smirked. "To the team who made it happen." Joanne leaned back in her chair. "So what now?" Grace exhaled. For the first time in forever, she didn't have to fight anymore. But she wasn't done yet. She set her glass down and looked at David. "That job offer still on the table?" David grinned. "Oh, absolutely." Joanne raised an eyebrow. "So you're going into law after all?" Grace smirked. "No." She turned to the screen, watching as Remington was shoved into the back of a police car. "I'm going into war."